So in today's video we're going to be installing an electrical block in this section of track, this one right here. I want to electrically isolate this section of track basically just because I park a lot of trains here and my layout is DCC and DC, so for trains that are DC I want to be able to park them right here, and also for trains that are DCC, if I decide to run the layout on DC at random, I can just park the DCC engines on here and I won't have any issues. So for most of you guys that have been in the hobby for a while, you'll probably know what electrical blocks are and how they were used, because up until the mid-2000s, DC was pretty much the only option, so a lot of people used this method to control trains individually, because on a regular DC layout, you cannot control trains individually. They all follow by whatever voltage is put into the track by the DC controller. This is where blocks changed the whole game. So we've got our CN engine there, our Go engine there. If we flip the switch right here, so that it's lined onto that track, and I'm just going to flip it over to DCC. This doesn't actually make a difference because these are both analog locomotives. I just want to do it for the example so you guys can see the lights on and exactly what happens. And we turn up the voltage. We can run the Go train onto the electrical block there, and as you can see, it turns off. Now, that's because this section of track is turned off. So now if we go over to the switchboard here, we can turn that section of track on. We can run the train onto it, and then we can turn that section of track off. So now, as you can see, the CN locomotive still has power, the Go engine does not. So now if we just flip it back over to DC, we can control the CN engine individually, and if we turn off the main line, turn on that electrical block, we now have control of the Go engine individually. So you can see how this would have been a major advantage back before DCC was around, and some really complicated systems could actually have multiple controllers, and you could control I think usually 2 trains. I think some people managed to get 3, although I don't know how you would do that. It was far more complicated, but there were ways to do it. And on modern layouts, this can still be used, because if you're like me, you may have old analog engines which cannot run on DCC tracks individually. You can only run one at a time. You can park those engines on electrical blocks, and they're separate from the layout now, so you can run all your DCC engines but still have analog engines sitting on the track. Also, at least with Bachmann's system, you can only have up to 10 different locomotives on the track, but you can have way more if you have electrical blocks. You can pretty much have as many as you want, because you could have, like, let's say 3 different engines that all share button number 7. But you could park 2 of those engines on electrical blocks, turn the blocks off, and now you can run one train individually. So even now they are still useful. And in my case, where I use a mix of DC and DCC, it's very helpful. So we're going to be electrically isolating this piece of track, so I can run trains onto it of any type, DC or DCC, and just park them there. And whatever goes on the main line is completely irrelevant to whatever's parked there. Now with electrical blocks, basically you have your 2 regular rails, but there's a difference. One rail is known as the common rail. That one's connected throughout the layout. Basically there's always power in this rail. Then you have the second rail. This is the one where you gain your control, because it is not connected to the rest of the layout. That's why it's electrically isolated, because you need positive and negative currents, and when you break that, you can't have it. So this rail actually gets its power through this wire and goes up to that controller over there. So that's how you basically control this section, which is by separating it from the rest of the layout. So this section gets its power from somewhere else, but it gets part of its power from the main line. Now, ever since I added electrical blocks in 2013, I basically would just isolate the pieces of track by only putting a rail joiner on one side, the common rail, not the other side, and just leaving a small gap between both the rails. But this method has turned out not to be impervious, because first of all, with heat fluctuations, which I have up here, especially in the wintertime when the basement's heated, these pieces of track can become connected, and any metal connection, even a light one, will allow power to get into the engine. So that can become live again. Now, quite fortunately for us, since electrical blocks have been around for so long, the manufacturers quickly caught on and started developing products for them, and this is one of them. This is an electrical block isolator / joiner. So what this does is it pretty much just acts as a regular joiner, except instead of it passing power through, it prevents power from getting through, and you can see there's just a bitty little piece that sticks out there, and that will prevent the rails from touching each other, thus preventing electrical connections. So this will prevent the electrical blocks from basically becoming connected back up to the main line. Now in my particular case, the inner rail acts as the common rail, the one that always has power flowing through it, and the outer one is the electrically isolated rail, which means we have to disconnect the track right here, remove the conventional rail joiner, and put our special new silicone rail joiner in. And then obviously we need to at some point connect a wire to this one, and in this case, since we have two sources where the train could come in, we also need to electrically isolate the track all the way over there. Unfortunately, doing this job in this spot is easier said than done, because on a conventional layout you would decide this in advance and install them while constructing the layout. In my case, the layout's been a work of progress since 2007, so it's gone through many different changes, cosmetic changes, and well, as you can tell now, electrical differences. So doing this unfortunately means I'm doing a little bit of work, so I'm going to try not to be too disruptive. And now we take out our old joiner. Start getting a grip on it. There we go. And now we just take our piece of track, put on our weird new joiner, and there we go. Now we just need to let the camera focus. There we go. Try to install this back as gently as possible. Connect up the old pieces of track. And stick our spikes back in. Now you would think rebuilding this section of track with a new joiner would be a lot easier, not having all that detail. I mean, you guys saw me rebuild all this, but evidently at some point I added some solder there, so we have to unsolder that, unfortunately, so we can add our new joiner. Now you're going to notice, obviously adding these rail joiners does cause the track to be a little bit offset since that little spacer is there. However, most modern layouts have thermal spacers, basically so that the track can contract and expand, and the spacers will prevent the track from breaking in ways you don't want it to. So if you build a track with thermal spacers, you might be able to coordinate it, so you can put these spacers in the same spots, because these can be adjusted a bit too. They can be squashed a bit. They're not made out of a tough type of plastic. Now you shouldn't have to worry about this, but if you want to make absolutely sure your track's electrically isolated, you can just run a train right onto the part of electrically isolated track, and if it stops, you know you did it right. So now it's time to drill our hole for the wire. Optimally, you want to build, the hole for your wire, the spot basically where it connects to the track. You want that to be as close as possible to your transformer. That way you don't have to use as many resources. In my case, I'm going to be building it a little further away because there's a spot in the ballast which isn't so good, so I'm okay drilling a hole through that. One thing you should know is that what I'm going to do is drill a hole on the inside, but most people drill them on the outside, that way it doesn't mess with the flanges. If you can pull off a really clean soldering job, this won't be an issue. So we're going to find that bad piece of track, or bad piece of ballast I should say, and drill. Through. Just need to find whereabouts. And there's our wire. So right here's our wire. Choosing to put it on the inside may turn out to be not such a great decision after all. Only time will tell at my soldering skills. I'll just adjust the camera so you guys can have a slightly better look. Now I'm going to tint the leads. This will just make our chances of getting a solid connection on the first time a little bit higher. So I'm just going to put the wire a little higher, put some flux on there. Just melt the flux on nicely. And here comes the solder. Really don't need much. And there's our tinted lead. Now I'm also going to pull the wire down. And we're going to tint the rail. This is where I have to be a lot more careful, because what I'm aiming to do is get the wire low enough that it will not affect any flanges on the wheels going over it. Flood the rail. I believe we have a connection, folks. It turned out my soldering iron had a bit of solder on it while we were tinting the rails with solder. Nothing a Swiss Army knife can't fix up. Now it obviously looks a little bit messy right now, but what we'll do is we'll hide that with ballast. And it doesn't seem to affect the flanges, so I guess I at least got the soldering job right, provided it actually has a connection. Here's the rail after I cleaned it up. Really nothing too bad. Now, believe it or not, in this cobweb of wires, there is some vague organization. I've labeled each number to which switch it goes to. Number 7 just so happens to be free. So that might just wind up being our connection of choice. So we have it all wired up. Okay, so we have our engine on the track now for the moment of truth. I think this is number switch 7. There we go. So we'll just turn that off. DC. And as you can see, we can control that engine. And just as I showed before, you can run them both. Or we could turn off block number 7 and just run the CN. Or we can turn off the main line, turn on block number 7, and we can just run the GO train. Pretty much do whatever we want. And they will operate completely separately. Well, that's it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and maybe even some of you learned a couple new things about model railroading and electrical blocks. So that will be about it for today's video, and thank you guys so much for watching.